Hi everyone. Today I'd like to talk to you about abstraction and the technique of reductive drawing. We're going to put these two together into one drawing project. So let's first start off by talking about what abstraction is. So far in this class, we've really tried our best to create representational art, which is to try to recreate what we're seeing in front of us with line and shape and value and form to make things look as realistic as possible. But abstract art uses the same visual language of shape, form, color, and line to create a composition that doesn't have a representational interpretation of a subject. So what you're looking at is just a composition that creates a very visually interesting composition that doesn't really necessarily look like something that you would see out in the real world. Now, someone that I would like for us to take inspiration from is Georgia O'Keeffe, who does work both in representational art and in abstract art. And I just wanted to show you an example of some of her work in representational art. And she really pulls a lot of her inspiration from the natural surroundings that are around her. And she really drew from the place where she was and the things that she saw in the world that she lived in. But then what she did was to look very closely at these things, like in a lot of cases, these objects, or I'm sorry, at flowers, where she would zoom in really close to the point where all you started to see were just shapes, color, line, value, and you don't necessarily see them as flowers anymore. So she took something that was representational and created an abstract painting out of it. Here's another example where it really is about line and value and shapes, and not really so much about saying this is a flower, but it's really about the visual language that she's using to create an interesting painting. What I would like to do for this assignment is to ask you to do something similar. Find a very natural object, in this case it was like a seashell, and zoom in really close and look at what you can find in those shapes and patterns and the lines. And remember that the finished drawing doesn't necessarily have to look like that object that you started off with, but what you're focusing on is to find all of those little details and draw them out so that you can really accentuate all those fine little nuances that you're seeing in the object that you found. Now, you could find these objects outside around the campus, but we also have a lot of these objects on the shelf in the studio. For instance, these bones. We have a bin, an art bin that's full of really nice little pine cones and pods. And I think there's a crab claw. There's a whole basket that's full of seashells. And if you just take any of these sorts of objects, just remember that what I want to see in the end is not a drawing of a seashell or of a skull, but of a very specific area that you want to zoom in on. So look closely and carefully at this. It's a different way of working. We're not going to sit back and hold up our viewfinders to look at a still life, but we're going to zoom in really close, and you're going to probably hold this object in your hand and inspect it carefully as you draw. And look for those areas where you can really pull out the lights. Now remember, this is a drawing that's going to be about subtractive drawing. I'm going to show you a little demo video in a little while about how to exactly do that. But notice that most of these are kind of in a darker tone, an all over darker tone. And what the students have done is to take an eraser and created almost the entire drawing just by erasing. So notice how these white lines are done in such a nice, beautiful, light and delicate way. It's because they started with an all-over tonal value and used their erasers to pull out the lights. So what you're looking for is where those light areas come in and how you can define them by just drawing with an eraser. So you're using the eraser as a drawing tool in this case. Now, in the very end of the drawing, if you see a few areas where you might want to go back and add some really dark emphasis areas, like in this drawing right here, you can go back and add some more charcoal, but I would like for you to think about most of this drawing as much as you can as something that you would do entirely with an eraser. Notice how this person has taken the eraser and created these sort of really soft, fuzzy kind of a texture with their eraser. And then right here along the stem, there's a very sharp line that creates sort of a highlight, like a shine. So you have two very different surfaces all created by this eraser. And here's another example of someone who started off with a very dark tone. So depending on what tonal value you start with in the background, you're going to have a difference in how dramatic your drawing finishes up. So if you start with a darker tone, you're going to have a lot more darks and lights to really play around with in the end. So I would suggest that you go ahead and start with sort of the darker tones, 3s, 4s, and 5s on your sheet of paper before you get started with your drawing.
Hi everyone, let's talk today about subtractive drawing. So up until now, you've mostly been putting marks on paper using graphite or charcoal, and what you're doing is adding this material to a sheet of paper. So this is additive drawing. Subtractive drawing is essentially removing the material from the paper with an eraser. So we are subtracting the material away from the surface. Now, up until now, you've probably used the eraser mostly to erase away stray marks or correct mistakes. The difference is now we're going to use the eraser as a drawing tool in itself, not just for corrections, but for the drawing itself. Now, you may have noticed in your drawings that when you erase on a piece of paper, the fibers of the paper that usually lay nice and flat, they get lifted up by the eraser and it becomes a soft fuzzy area. And then it reacts differently with the material that you're drawing with. And then it's a little bit harder to erase each time. And that's because of the nature of the fibers of the paper. So in order to create a good surface for doing a lot of erasing, I've asked you to prepare this sheet of paper with gesso. So you should have coated the sheet of paper with at least one nice smooth coating of gesso and brushed out all those brush marks to get it as smooth as possible. Now the gesso sits on top of the paper so that when you're erasing down onto it, it keeps those paper fibers laying flat and you can't get to those fibers to lift them up, and so you always have a smooth surface to work on. Now in order to prepare this surface for our drawing, I'm going to ask you to pull out your willow charcoal and your vine charcoal and your compressed charcoal. And what we're going to do is go ahead and just cover the whole surface with a layer of charcoal. I'm going to put it down pretty much all over the entire surface and then smooth it out by smudging with a paper towel. Now I do want to point out that I'm rubbing very gently. I'm not trying to scrub away the charcoal. I'm actually just brushing it lightly and smoothly over the surface to create a smooth tonal surface that's a little bit on the darker side of the value scale, around 3 or 4. But I do want a lot of the charcoal to actually stay put. So I'm softly, gently just smoothing it out without actually lifting off much of the charcoal with the paper towel. Now, a little bit of variation in the tonal quality is going to be fine. That might actually even help your drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some techniques with 2 erasers that we've been working with, a white vinyl eraser and a kneaded eraser. They do have different qualities that you can work with this kind of drawing. Let's start with the vinyl eraser. We've noticed before that the vinyl eraser can get really nice white marks. It really pulls away a lot of material. And you can do some really nice little detailed dots and dashes and lines. And sometimes you'll notice that you end up getting a lot of charcoal on a corner. One way to clean it would be to just take it to a scrap sheet of paper and just erase a little bit, and then you've got a clean spot again. And you can go back and start working with that clean spot. Now think about some of the marks that you can make that are beyond just eraser marks. Like you can make some dot lines and dashes and some cross hatching even with an eraser. So think of this as really a drawing tool, just like you would with a pencil or a piece of charcoal. Now something else that I like to do with my vinyl eraser is cut it into the shapes that I need. So you can use like a utility knife and just cut a corner right off your vinyl eraser, and it makes a nice small piece to work with. And with that really fine line that was cut, you can create some really fine marks. And that's all just drawn with that really fine corner that I just created. Along with that technique, you can also think of this width as a mark making tool. So you can draw with the width of that eraser, that same cut that you've made. So this is pretty pliable and easy to cut, so feel free to cut up your own eraser into different kinds of shapes or sizes that are comfortable for you to work with. So already we've created a lot of different kinds of marks with just your vinyl eraser. Now let's talk about the kneaded eraser. Remember that we can always knead the eraser to find nice clean areas, and the nice thing about this kneaded eraser is you can really shape it into different shapes that you can then make marks with. And it doesn't hold its shape very well because it's so soft, but that does make it really nice and pliable, and you can just keep working it without needing to cut it. You can just knead it into the shape that you need, into the size and shape that makes the right mark that you want. Now notice that this whole time I've been using it just like an eraser. I've been pulling away material, but the nice thing about these kneaded erasers is that if you create a design, let's create some sort of a pattern, maybe like a teardrop pattern. You can shape the tip of it into a specific shape, and you can use it as like a stamping tool to pick up directly straight up by pulling directly straight up from the paper. It'll just pull the charcoal straight up. So those are a couple different ways that you can use your kneaded eraser. So have some fun with it. You know, if you have some parts that you feel like you've made a mistake, you want to go back over it, it's really easy. You can just go back over it with whatever charcoal is left on your paper towel, or you can just draw right over it. So this is like your erasing tool. And try to make as many different kinds of marks as you can and have some fun with it. And just remember that most of the drawing should be done with your erasers.